There is this one cave in Australia that is so dangerous and mysterious, no one actually wanted to go in it. Andrew White was the only person that really wanted to explore this cave and see what is down below. He soon realized that even though he had a ton of experience, diving this cave was extremely deadly. He consulted some doctors and they told him that his divers would most likely get decompression sickness so severely they would suffer for life, or they would just get killed. You're going to want to stick around to the end of the story. It is one of the craziest and has one of the most unexpected and sad deaths you'll ever hear of. Far below the Australian outback are some of the largest and most unknown cave systems on Earth. Expert cave diver Andrew White led a 15-person expedition to the Flanagan Plains system. This cave is one of the many that labyrinth the world's largest continuous piece of limestone bedrock, on top of which lies the Nullarbor Plain. This would be the most crucial expedition of Andrew's life. Above the cave's surface is a vast treeless desert on the Western Australian and South Australian border. Below are subterranean caverns and passages partially filled with water that flows into the Great Australian Bight. As of today, this cave is now closed due to the events that took place in the story. A sign near the entrance to Flanagan Plains Cave states entry is denied. Andrew grew up on a farming property near Harrow in Western Victoria, Australia. He started caving while still at school, exploring the local volcanic caves near Viaduct. During his childhood, Andrew was always exploring. He would stay out late with his friends, trying to find new places to climb around his home. When Andrew was studying agricultural science at La Trobe University, he would spend his time diving the water-filled sinkholes and caves of the lower southeast of Australia. They fascinated him, and he spent most of the day dreaming about his next adventure. He looked up to famous explorers and wanted to be one of the people in the history books that future generations would learn about. So he surrounded himself with people that were caving, and if you did not enjoy caving, Andrew would ask you to join him on his next adventure so you could become inspired. Everyone who met Andrew could feel the energy and passion that he had for caving, and it was a bright spot in many people's lives. But out of everyone, it was his parents that were most proud of him. It made perfect sense that he took the next step and eventually became one of Victoria's first EADI dive instructors and one of Australia's most recognized cave divers. His friends and family knew that Andrew would get these certifications because it was literally all that he talked about. Andrew explored many caves and sinkholes all over Australia. Any downtime that he had would allow him to plan his next adventure. At this point, he knew that gaining more experience would eventually allow him to explore Australia's most profound and deadly caves, the kind his friends and colleagues in the community actually warned him about. As a result of all his cave journeys, a documentary film of his explorations to remote caves in the Australian outback would catch the attention of Hollywood director James Cameron. Flanagan Plains Cave is a monster, and Andrew had set his sights on exploring it for some time. Unfortunately, this cave was known to have flash floods, and for that reason alone, almost no one would try to explore its depths. This cave is unique, and it took many years for it to form. The Middle Australian state is bookended by two huge sheets of limestone formed under the sea. An Adelaide-based hydrologist named Ian Lewis started exploring these outback caves and realized how deep they go. Cave diving at an elite level is about mastery and precision. Getting to that point takes years of dedicated training, practice, and experience, and access to cave sites is difficult. This is because hazards are real, even if the community is sensitive to public perception and prefers not to talk about them. For example, when a person dives into the ocean, they have life and can resurface if they get into any trouble. A cave diver cannot. Thrill seekers and adrenaline junkies are not welcome. Probably the most lethal period in cave diving history came in the 70s when 11 people died in 6 years. This prompted the creation of the Cave Divers Association and the introduction of a training program designed to save people from themselves. Since then, Australian cave diving has had a reasonably good safety record. Flanagan Plains Cave is only accessible by experienced scuba divers or accompanied by them. Andrew and his team, comprised of world-class cave divers, scientists, and technicians, set out from Adelaide in 1988 to dive Flanagan Plains. Along with expert scuba divers, Andrew brought an underwater camera crew to accompany the expedition to sell the breathtaking footage. They were determined to explore the furthest reaches of the cave in an adventure that would test the limits of human endurance, and everyone involved was aware of this. It was well documented that there were extreme risks when diving so deep and in such isolation, but there were rewards as well. This cave had massive underwater cathedrals and beautiful limestone rock formations, all waiting to be revealed for the first time. Andrew had it in his head that this could be one of the first moments in his life that would be worthy of the history books. Anytime there was a setback or things got hard during the expedition, Andrew would remember that this trip was his dream. Being the first people to ever venture that far into this geological wonderment, the team would conduct a series of scientific studies in conjunction with the University of Sydney. Dr. Julia James led the university's researchers. She was a lecturer in inorganic chemistry and a world-renowned authority on cave minerals, atmospheres, and water. She explained scientists and cave explorers had always enjoyed a close relationship on Melbourne Plain, formed during the initial exploration of dry caves. The scientists can get into dry caves with no issues and collect samples and specimens without expert divers being there alongside them. However, now they were going one step further because the scientists were not expert divers and could not dive the depths of this cave themselves. This trip meant more than just an exploration, as the scientists had hoped this cave could offer up some potential breakthroughs in modern science based on what they found extremely deep in the cave. There are samples that no one in the world has yet to collect. These samples can also give new information about these caves on the Nullarbor Plain. The entrance to Planikin is nothing more than a hole in the desert. Still, like scaling a mountain peak, there are deadly dangers at every turn once inside. Their lives depend on the gas tanks, regulators, and other equipment, and if their gear malfunctions hundreds of feet from the safety of fresh air, they die. So the rules of cave diving slowly formed over decades of deadly trial and error, including the rule of thirds for gas tanks. A third of the gas to venture in, a third to get out, and a third always kept for emergencies. While the water is clear, the slightest touch on the surface could fill the passage with silt and blind the divers. So the team decided they would practice the use of having 3 lights always carried on their body to light a way through the darkness in case one or even 2 of them failed. They also set a guideline stretching a continuous length back to the cave's exit. But Andrew and his team knew the risk and had spent months planning for every contingency, though Mother Nature had one final surprise up her sleeve. Andrew spent time researching diving disasters in other caves in preparation for this expedition. Members of the dive team included Andrew, Ron Alum, and push divers Chris Brown, Dr. Peter Rogers, Phil Pruss, and Paul Arbon, then continued a long way with the camera crew. After arriving at Planikin Plains, the team began preparing for the expedition. First, they spent 3 days setting up camp and eventually lowering their gear, all 5 tons of it, from the cave mouth into the lake room. Then, after scootering for more than a mile underwater, they reached Concord Landing. This is a vast underground chamber with ceilings high enough to fit a church in the length of several football fields where they set up their final base camp. From here, the push divers would venture into the previously unexplored ancient passageways, floating through serene landscapes where no human had ever been before. They used dive scooters that could take them up to 3.5 miles into the passage. Dive scooters helped them move faster, but added more variables to the dive and thus more risk. The team knew that the cave was uncharted, and there would most likely be caverns and air-filled chambers, but to not enter unless the line was secured to allow them back out. Expert cave divers carry extra gas tanks and roll-out guidelines behind them, leading the way back to the surface through the submerged passageways. When you are in an uncharted cave and do not use a line, there is a significantly higher possibility of getting lost or drowning due to the tank running out of gas. This trip was exhilarating for the team, but safety had to come first if they wanted to survive. Cave diving is not like mountaineering, where you can survey the top and know what equipment you have to take. Every dive presents a new challenge and danger. You have to constantly recalculate, and this can lead to the dive's excitement and also increase adrenaline. The team held a meeting where they had to decide if they wanted to attempt to find whether a passage they had previously discovered continued further and deeper. This was a big decision, because the dive would be profound. so deep it was past the end of known decompression tables. There was concern that exploring these passageways would be a one-way tour to drowning, but the group agreed that they would actually do it. They grabbed their scooters and gear and headed down the passage. There was some problems with buoyancy at times, but for the most part the dive was successful. Finally they reached the end of the cave system, and then they returned to the lake room, where they met the rest of their crew to pack up their gear and get ready to head home. The team was in high spirits overall. The mood was that everything was going to be okay from here on out. It turns out something frightening was happening outside of the cave's confines. Above the cave, a massive once-in-a-decade storm hit the building, which dumped rain into the desert 2 years worth in 45 minutes, along with golf ball-sized hail and 100-mile-an-hour winds. Like something out of a movie, the severe flood, estimated at 100 million gallons of water, began pouring down into the cave entrance, soaking and loosening the rock until it suddenly collapsed in an avalanche of rubble. The noise from this amount of water rushing in was thunderous and also sent tremors throughout the cave. The water was bursting into facets all around the cavern and filling any dry parts with water. As the water was rushing in, the 15-person team had been halfway up the cave mouth, attempting to exit. At first it seemed like someone was pulling a bad joke on them, and some chatter about how inappropriate a joke would be considering the danger of their expedition. But now they could hear and feel the water coming towards them. Fear turned into shock, which quickly made members of the group frantic. They did not prepare for the cave to become flooded with water or the boulders to collapse, trapping them underground. They knew that if the water filled the area they were currently in, it would cause a quick drowning death. They had a chance if it was just the boulders falling. Fortunately, the only way out was blocked by those falling boulders. Team members Vicky, Bonwick, and Andrew had been the furthest ahead. They remained perched on a ledge between rushing water and the shifting roof of the cave. They were trapped as rushing water was flowing right below them. They needed to find a way to stay on the sledge. If they fell off, the water current would pull them down the tunnel and into the abyss. After 5 grueling hours, Andrew convinced Vicky that they had to move or risk being swept away by the rising water. They decided to move rather than stay and risk the roof collapsing further and getting crushed by a boulder. They were in a lot of pain holding their position on the ledge, but could climb along the cave wall to a high, dry spot. Andrew realized there were a lot of crevices in the wall, and they could use them to climb down the tunnel of the cave. The cavern they were in was so large, the water had not filled it up yet, so they still had time. They managed to wriggle their way through crevices and back to the surface, but there were still 13 people trapped in the cave. Andrew knew that if he did not act fast, everyone trapped in the cave would die. The sheer amount of destruction caused by the water blew Andrew's mind. He never thought in his worst fears something like this would happen, but Mother Nature had its own plans. Andrew had called for help, which quickly initiated a rescue mission. The group was trapped underground, but safe for now because they were in a dry room and didn't have a torrent of water tearing through it yet. However, the roof was still unstable, and large chunks were starting to crumble down. A portion of the roof could fall directly on a group member and kill them at any moment. They could hear the water working its way towards them and tension to the building because they needed to find a way out. They had rationed all their food and water just in case they could not find a way out and had to wait for rescue. Finally, a group member pointed out a small opening. They were determined to risk the dangerous rock falls to climb to safety. The rescue team established contact with the group thanks to a two-way radio capable of transmitting through solid rock. Again, the rescuers were willing to risk their lives to enter the cave and bring the trapped people to safety. They were gradually, one by one, led up, traversing hundreds of feet to the surface. Miraculously, all 15 people made their way out of the cave with just minor injuries. The footage captured by cameraman Wes Skiles, one of the last out of the cave, was made into a documentary titled Nullarbor Dreaming. Andrew would go on to become a successful movie producer working on 45 films, mostly ocean exploration documentaries, and co-writing the hit 2011 film Sanctum, loosely based on the Flanagan Plains expedition. Thanks to Cameron's name attached as executive producer, the film made $100 million worldwide. Sadly, on February 4th, 2012, Andrew White and the award-winning American cinematographer Mike DeGroot died in a helicopter crash off the east coast of Australia. The Sydney Morning Herald reports that White was piloting the helicopter, which crashed during the takeoff from an airstrip on the south coast of New South Wales on Saturday afternoon local time. Mike was the only other person on board. I want to say thanks for watching the video, and don't forget to subscribe if you like the content. And I have many other disaster videos on my channel that you might want to check out. See you at the next one.
The deep sea can be a barren realm. With increasing depth, we find an exponential decline in biomass, which has driven creatures of the deep to adapt in weird and wonderful ways. Generally, these organisms must rely on marine snow as a source of food. A trickle of fecal pellets and dead organic material that drifts downwards from the surface waters, where photosynthetic primary productivity is possible. Below 200 meters, levels of ambient light from the sun are too low for photosynthesis to occur, and at around 1,000 meters, aside from the infrequent twinkling of bioluminescence, the ocean is drowned in pure darkness. Without photosynthesis, the supply of scraps are all that remain to nourish any life. However, on the deep sea floor, there are important regions where primary production is possible via a different mechanism called chemosynthesis. These are the chemosynthetic oases of the deep sea, which represent some of the only locations on Earth where the ultimate source of energy for life is not sunlight, but the Earth itself. In this series of films, we'll delve into their formation and ecology, as well as the threats they face, and the importance of stewardship for these fascinating environments. The process of chemosynthesis is similar to photosynthesis. Both can be defined as the creation of organic matter from the fixation of inorganic carbon using energy. But what differs is the source of that energy. In parts of the deep sea, primary production is fueled by chemical energy, rather than energy from the sun. But this can only take place at certain seafloor environments where the required chemicals are released into the water. The two main examples of such environments are hydrothermal vents and cold seeps. The former were only discovered in 1977 when scientists were exploring an oceanic spreading ridge near the Galapagos Islands. What they discovered was a hidden world that revolutionized our understanding of how and where life on Earth can exist. Since then, hundreds more vent fields have been discovered, often at depths of 2 kilometers or more, along Earth's convergent plate boundaries and at seafloor spreading regions where the oceanic crust is moving apart. One major site of high vent abundance is the East Pacific Rise, where the fast spreading rates have created vent fields dotted along the ridge, tens of kilometers apart. In contrast, the vent fields of the much slower spreading mid-Atlantic ridge may be hundreds of kilometers apart. They form here because the rifting of tectonic plates creates fissures in the crust and allows hot magma from deep within the Earth to rise closer to the seabed. Upper parts of the sea floor are very permeable, cold seawater enters and percolates down through the crust where it becomes superheated and takes up minerals from the surrounding rocks. This mineral-rich fluid then jets back into the ocean at extremely high velocities and temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius. As the fluids mix with cold seawater, the dissolved minerals precipitate out in smoke-like billows and build towering chimney structures on the sea floor. There are a few varieties of hydrothermal vent, characterized by the specific mineral content of the vent fluid. Black smokers emit the hottest, darkest plumes, forming chimneys over 15 meters tall, with high levels of sulfides that precipitate on contact with the cold ocean to form the black smoke. In contrast, white smokers contain barium, calcium, and silicon. Other vents may be characterized simply by shimmering streams of water. Although the throat of vent chimneys can reach around 400 degrees Celsius, there is a very sharp temperature gradient between the fluid and the surrounding seawater. Across a distance of around 10 centimeters, temperatures can drop from over 300 degrees to just 2 degrees Celsius. Most vent animals live at far cooler temperatures, but prokaryotic microbes, including forms of both archaea and bacteria, are able to tolerate fluids as hot as 122 degrees Celsius. Here, they carry out chemosynthesis via a number of different pathways that depend on the specific conditions of their microenvironment and the chemicals that are present. Typically, they use energy stored in the chemical bonds of hydrogen sulfide and methane to create glucose from water and dissolved carbon dioxide. The result of this chemosynthetic primary productivity is the presence of vast assemblages of animal life, concentrated at these regions. The supply of nutrients forms the basis of a food web for a diverse community of specialized organisms. An oasis of life in the deep. To understand just how significant these communities are, you only have to compare the life of hydrothermal vents with non-chemosynthetic deep-sea environments. Out on the abyssal plain, life is present but scattered. Animals must spread out in order to stand a chance of gaining enough nutrients from marine snow to sustain themselves. But at the vents, the chimneys are encased with dense colonies of rust-colored snails, swarms of deep-sea shrimp, or expansive aggregations of ghostly white crabs competing for space on the rocks. Remarkably, these varied and abundant species are all sharing a single resource. They all rely on the chemosynthetic microbes as a source of food, meaning vents are sites of significant interspecific competition, that is, competition between members of different species. Often, interspecific competition can lead to the extinction of one or more of the species competing. The species that is less suitably adapted may lose out on the resources it requires and become out-competed. The idea that in a stable ecosystem, no two species can have exactly the same niche and stably coexist is known as the competitive exclusion principle. But when this doesn't lead to extinction, interspecific competition can instead cause specialization of the different animals. A phenomenon called resource partitioning occurs, where species with overlapping fundamental niches evolve different adaptations. It allows the species to coexist because there is less direct competition between them. This is what occurred at hydrothermal vents to make them so stable. The competing crabs, worms, and shrimps may all be in pursuit of the same resources, but they have developed very different ways of acquiring them. Squat lobsters and limpets graze the microbial mats that surround many of the chimneys. We also find suspension feeders like deep-sea mussels feeding on free-living microbes that are suspended in the water. Yeti crabs farm the bacteria in filamentous hair-like colonies on their bodies, reducing the pressure on the crabs to compete for space with other species like shrimps. The crabs are able to move around and take the bacteria with them, with the microbes acting as epibiotes inhabiting their surface. Giant tube worms are sessile, meaning they are fixed in one place and cannot move. Their competitive advantage arises from their ability to form an endosymbiotic relationship with the microbes. They store them within their tubes, effectively holding them captive and benefiting from the nutrients they produce. The worms take up hydrogen sulfide and other chemicals from the vent fluids in order to feed the bacteria. In return, the bacteria provide the carbon that the tube worms require in order to live. It is also thought that the bacteria benefit by being sheltered within the tube worms and are therefore protected from predatory grazers like limpets and crabs. Another denizen of deep-sea vents, the Pompeii worm, farms bacterial colonies in a similar fashion to Yeti crabs, but its higher thermal tolerance allows it to inhabit locations on the vent structures that are far hotter than those that the crabs can endure. Here, they dwell within U-shaped tubes, which can reach temperatures up to 80 degrees Celsius. Thus, much like we see with creatures of the rocky intertidal zone, there is zonation here between different animal species, which occurs due to the presence of a temperature gradient and varying abundances of different microbe varieties. In a way, the worms and crabs have become geographically isolated from one another within the same vent system. All the creatures we've discussed so far can be classed as primary consumers, but organisms from higher trophic levels are also present. The octopus, for example, is one of the top predators of deep-sea vents, along with white zoarcid fish, which feed on the tube worms and shrimps. Some deep-sea skates, which tend to dwell along the continental slope, visit hydrothermal vents to feed, but also to lay their eggs. They do so in order to use the volcanic heat to accelerate egg development and reduce the usually years-long incubation time. The zonation of life at vents leads to a higher abundance of filter feeders and predators in the periphery, further from the chimneys. Animals like stalked barnacles and predatory anemones are less tolerant of the chemical-rich, low-oxygen conditions found closer to the fluids, but they can still make a living here. Beyond the periphery, we find non-vent deep-sea fauna existing on the abyssal plain near the vent systems at higher abundances than they're typically found. This is because, even hundreds of meters away from the vent itself, animals can still make use of some of the exported organic matter. In all, over 590 animal species have been identified living at hydrothermal vents, and a surprising majority of these organisms are unique to this environment, having become specialized in such a way that means they rely entirely on the chemosynthetic conditions of the vents. The discovery of deep-sea hydrothermal vents was groundbreaking for another reason. Their unique conditions and the abundant nutrients of these chemical gardens led to scientists speculating whether these vents could be where life on Earth originated. Although unproven, there is substantial evidence to suggest this may be the case. Firstly, some of the thermophilic or heat-loving vent microbes are among the most primitive organisms known on Earth. Evidence is also given by the fact that many of the chemical building blocks of life are found at the vents, suggesting that the precursors of life harnessed carbon dioxide and hydrogen available in those primitive conditions to create complex organic molecules such as amino acids and nucleotides. In conclusion, hydrothermal vents support unique ecosystems, and their communities of both highly specialized as well as simple organisms in the deep ocean. The islands of abundance they create in the otherwise barren depths are sites of outstanding scientific interest, providing a new insight into what is truly necessary for life to survive. But vents are not the only seafloor regions where primary productivity can occur. Along continental margins and down in oceanic trenches, we find cold seeps. Regions where cool, hydrocarbon-rich water escapes from the ocean floor and provides the necessary conditions for chemosynthetic assemblages to form. These mirror vent systems in a number of ways, but they give rise to an alternative set of conditions for life to adapt to and exploit. The geological origins of cold seeps differs from hydrothermal vents. While vents form from volcanic activity at seafloor spreading regions, cold seeps instead arise at the other end of oceanic plates, where they are subducted at the continental margin. Their formation begins with the burial of organic material under sediments on the sea floor. These organic compounds degrade over time, producing methane. Geological processes like the tectonic compression of sediments and subduction zones forces the methane from deep reservoirs up through the overlying sediments. Anaerobic microbes dwelling below the sediment surface oxidize this methane using sulfate, producing hydrogen sulfide and bicarbonate ions as a byproduct. This hydrogen sulfide, along with any residual methane, then serves as a vital energy source for chemosynthetic microbes. Thus, it is a consortium of two distinct sets of microbes that makes primary productivity possible at cold seeps, and lays the foundations of food webs here. The result is an environment remarkably similar to hydrothermal vents. We have a flux of sulfide and methane at the sea floor, chemosynthetic microbes using these compounds, and an abundance of life exploiting this productivity, fulfilling similar ecological niches and forming biodiversity hotspots in the deep sea. 70% of the Earth's surface is abyssal plain, a great, flat, sediment-covered region of the deep sea floor, characterized by low biodiversity due to the absence of primary productivity. But upon finding a cold sea, you're met with a seafloor region that's booming with life. Beds of Bathymodiolus mussels, endemic to chemosynthetic oases, encase the landscape. These animals seem to dominate chemosynthetic communities due to their ability to form an endosymbiotic association with the microbes. They host the bacteria within their gills and benefit directly from the food and energy they produce. The mussels also support other species, grazers like gastropods and orbinate polychaetes, as well as scavengers like shrimp and squat lobsters, picking at organic detritus produced by the mussels. Suboglanid tube worms, belonging to the same family as the tube worms of hydrothermal vents, can be found here too. In a similar fashion to vent tube worms, they allow microbes to inhabit their internal trophosome, an organ specially adapted for housing chemosynthetic microbes. But one key difference between tube worms and vents and seeps arises from seep environments being soft sedimented rather than hard rock. Hydrothermal vents are located at mid-ocean ridges where sediment hasn't had time to accumulate on the newly formed oceanic crust. So the worms must obtain the sulfides from the water via their plume. In contrast, cold sea tube worms are able to burrow down into sediments and take up sulfide via their roots rather than just the plumes. They're even able to establish their extensive root system in the hard carbonate rocks that form at cold seeps. The continuous supply of sulfides sustains them for very long periods of time, allowing them to be slow growing. It's estimated that they may be able to live for over 200 years, forming tube worm bushes, which can contain hundreds of individual worms. Just like the mussel beds, these bushes create a complex 3D environment that supports a range of other organisms. Nestled among the cracks and crevices created by the mussel beds, we find another cold sea denizen you might recognize from hydrothermal vents. Although these yeti crabs are a different species to the ones at vents, they exhibit a similar trophic adaptation and farm colonies of bacteria on their bodies as epibionts inhabiting their surface. These crabs have developed long, hairy, claw-bearing arms, or chelae, which they wave directly in the sulfide-rich seepage. Predatory organisms such as octopuses, fish, and larger crabs are attracted to this vibrant community to complete the food chain. Incredibly, the abundant life of cold seeps significantly reduces the flux of methane from the sea floor to the water column, for organisms here represent the only biological methane sink in the ocean. This is called the benthic filter. At cold seeps with bacterial mass, it's thought that between 50 and 90% of released methane is consumed and taken out of the system. Since methane is a potent greenhouse gas which contributes to a warming climate, this consumption of methane by seafloor life has a major impact on regulating the global climate. Variations in the underlying geological processes can give rise to different types of cold seep environment, often with distinct communities adapted to the unique abiotic challenges. Types of cold seep include mud volcanoes, gas hydrate beds, asphalt seeps, and brine pools. Mud volcanoes form when methane gas and warm fluidized mud rise from over a kilometer beneath the sea floor, exploding out of the sediment in pulses. Over time, this builds up mud in the shape of a cone that protrudes from the sea floor and may be many kilometers wide. This is perhaps the most challenging cold seep variety for life to inhabit, as the soft, flowing mud makes it almost impossible for animals to settle. But along the borders of mud volcanoes, beyond the region prone to eruption, we occasionally find bacterial mats and meadows of tube worms thriving on the methane. Not all sites of methane seepage form mud volcanoes. Methane hydrate, sometimes called methane ice, is a frozen form of methane combined with water that forms in high-pressure, low-temperature conditions, meaning it's stable here at the deep sea floor, where it forms mounds. During their 2017 expedition in the Gulf of Mexico, NOAA's remotely operated vehicle encountered these gas hydrate mounds at depths at around 1,050 meters. On the outcrops themselves, the only macrofauna identified as living directly on the methane hydrate was a species of polychaete called ice worms. At only 2 to 4 centimeters long, these worms burrow into the hydrate, creating small depressions and survive by grazing on chemosynthetic bacteria that grow on the hydrate surface. Around the edges, streams of methane bubbles could be seen rising up towards the surface, sometimes encased in clear tubes of hydrate. The bubbles seem to attract assemblages of fish, darting in and out of the streams of bubbling methane, as well as fields of anemones and sea stars. This footage, captured by MBARI scientists in 2011, shows a deep-sea crab mistaking the movement of a stream of methane for food. As it came in contact with the bubbles, the gas solidified, coating the crab's claws and freezing its mouthparts together, forming a milk moustache of solid hydrate. at around 3,000 meters below sea level, also in the Gulf of Mexico. Scientists discovered that vast areas of the sea floor were covered with swathes of asphalt. These asphalt seeps formed when petroleum deposits deep beneath the sea floor leaked out into the water. Lighter components rose up towards the surface and left behind denser hydrocarbons that solidified on the seabed. The result is an underwater landscape that resembles a cooled lava field. But despite seeming inhospitable, a unique community of organisms has been found living on and around the asphalt, exhibiting a new kind of cold seep habitat that remains poorly understood. In 2014, a sonar showed a cluster of structures at a depth of 1,900 meters, also in the Gulf of Mexico, with a large size indicative of a sunken wreck. When explorers from NOAA approached the site with their ROV, they stumbled upon an enormous formation, splayed out over the seabed like a flower. Later dubbed a tar lily, this was discovered to be an extrusion of asphalt. The thick, gooey hydrocarbon mass had been squeezed out from deep reservoirs in rope-like formations that bent and flowed into petal shapes, becoming hard and brittle over time. More volatile hydrocarbons dissolved, so the petals shrunk. Cracks formed, and the lily provided a hard substrate that bacteria could colonize, using the oil for primary production and transforming this extrusion into a localized chemosynthetic paradise. Anemones and corals anchor themselves on the ledges, while tube worms are wedged among the many fractures. Another process, salt diaperism, occurs when salt flats are buried beneath other types of sediment.
Uh-oh, did I get banned?